Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carolina Navarro. I'm the Deputy Director of the Horological Society of New York, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our December lecture. Here are a few quick announcements before we get started. We still have a few classes left before the year ends, including 4 courses in New York City and a traveling education stop in Seattle this weekend. And what's better than going to Hawaii, taking our watchmaking courses there? We're starting off 2023 in beautiful Honolulu on January 13th. For tickets, please visit our website. In case you missed it, our HSNY shop is live, and we have some incredible items just in time for the holidays. New to our shop are the lens cloth pocket square and the watchmaker's loop, both HSNY exclusives. All proceeds go towards our mission of advancing the art and science of horology, and we have some samples in the front if you want to take a look after the lecture. Okay, and now on to our lecture. Tonight we cross the Swiss border into France, another land of watchmaking. Please join me in saying bienvenue to Colin de Tonnac, watchmaker, CEO, and founder at Semper and Adhuc, who is here from Labouheyre, France, to discuss the evolution of French watchmaking and its revival.
Thank you very much. Thank you all to be here tonight. It's really an honor for me to be amongst you. So, people call me crazy. Well, maybe crazy because I do an absurd job by spending hours and hours on very tiny components of an obsolete, completely obsolete technology, mechanical watches. Maybe even crazier that I managed to sell them to people that nowadays have absolutely no need for them anymore. But no, people call me crazy because I'm doing this absurd job in France rather than in Switzerland. But it's a great relief for me tonight that one could argue that I'm maybe not the only crazy in the room. I mean, I'd love to hear the excuses you made up for your respective partner to come here and gather to listen to a total stranger speaking about this obsolete technology. The fact that you do it on a monthly basis is even better. So thank you for that. And so my slightly crazy and very passionate fellow HSNY members, let's talk about France. So for a starter, who owns a French watch tonight? Okay, 4, 5. I love you for that, but we have to admit that we are outnumbered here. Outnumbered by who? Who owns a Swiss watch tonight? Yeah, et voilà. So, it's a fact, Swiss have won the race of watchmaking. But this doesn't deny the fact that there is other nations of watchmaking, and amongst them there is France that certainly deserve our full attention. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about clock and watchmaking in France. Oh, just as a starter, it's a friend, Romaric, who came up with the idea to make a clock with some baguettes in it. Yeah, he's the guy from Second, and he has an extremely accurate nose, so 3 days later, baguette became World Heritage by the UNESCO. Like, it's great. So I'm super happy to have this baguette clock tonight. So we're going to start by a brief timeline of time measurement. So I want us to remember that history of watchmaking, like any other human and social science, it's not really definitive. It keeps evolving. It evolves through the discovery that we make. It can be based on academical research or sometimes driven more by marketing desire. And what's true today is only true until another piece of data or another watch is discovered. So we must keep a distance from our knowledge and be ready to question it regularly. And that's quite an interesting adventure to do it. So from the very beginning, humankind was really interested in time And I think they understood that everything was part of a bigger cycle. The cycle of days and nights, the cycle of life and death, the cycle of the sun rising and going back to bed. Sorry, some translation won't be good tonight. I'm sorry for that. The cycle of the moon, the cycle of the stars, everything is a cycle, so humankind tried to measure it. And they did it with some devices like the sundials, and after the clepsydra, and after even with some graduated candles. But all those devices were more, if you will, witnesses of the time flowing by, flowing ahead, that you can't really catch, that you can't capture, that you can't control. So, to control time, you need another technology which is called an escapement. An escapement is a technology that takes time, divides it in really little pieces, and count those pieces. And the first track that we have of an escapement dates back to 250 BC in ancient Greece, where Philo, an engineer, described a watch stand that was able to dispense a certain amount of water and a pumice to wash your clothes. And what's interesting for us is that in the same text, where it describes really well the technology, he said that this device is also used in clocks. But for a certain reason, we don't have any tracks of those clocks. And we kind of lose tracks of any escapement. And we'll have to wait until the 11th century in China for Susong's hydromechanical clock. So this clock was planted right next to a river, which made her hydromechanical, and she was dispensing many information about the stars and everything like that, so we call it an astronomical clock. And she used an escapement. But the same as before, we kind of lose track of the continuity in the construction of such a clock. And we'll have to wait until the very end of the 13th century to find other clocks in Europe. So, sorry. So the very late 13th century is the time that we date the very first mechanical clock per se. Why? Because the energy source of this clock was also from men that would have to wind and crank very heavy weights for them to work. So the next invention that was important for us is also the energy matters, because it's the appearance of the mainspring in 1410. And this is important for us because it allows us to go to different scales. And Watchmaker always really liked little things, so they went to miniaturization of the timepieces, which ultimately led to the birth of the first watch in the very early 16th century. And then everything accelerates very much. So you get the appearance of the pendulum in 1675, and then the balance spring in 1675. And those two new oscillators allow us to have really more accurate timepieces. And so we see the appearance of the minute hand in 1695. Then the 18th century in Europe was all about expedition, boat travel, and colonization of lands. And to be able to go to other land with very long boat trip, you need to know where you are exactly. And to know where you are exactly at sea, you have to have a very accurate timing machine. the governments and the kings knew it, and so they really promote the work of the watchmakers in that time by making some context. For example, this is the Longitude Act in 1714, and it was really a great century for watchmaking. Such a century that we have the appearance of the second hands on more regular basis on timepieces at this time. And fast forward then, we are going to the 20th century with the diffusion of the first wristwatches on a large scale, because the wristwatches dates back from long ago, but they were not that much well promoted. And then these wristwatches went from mechanical to electrical, which leads us to atomical clock, and then ultimately the quartz watch. And now we even have some optical clock. I don't know if some of you heard about it. It's catching and trapping atom of strontium, and it's going even more accurate than the atomic clock. And people say that by 2025 to 2030, we'll be able to witness a new standard of the second unit, which is kind of a big thing. As a watchmaker, I mean, not maybe for everybody, but I'm kind of excited. So let's dive into the late medieval period of the Kingdom of France, with the appearance of the new verge escapement, or chrome wheel escapement, with its new oscillators, the folio. So this is the device you see on the top left. This new escapement allows to make some monumental public clocks. And so many of them were made in France during those 2 centuries. Every major city wanted a public clock. One could say that it was even the presence of those monumental clocks that made the city greatness. So for an example, in 1354, we've got the astronomical clock of Strasbourg, which we call the Three Kings clock, because at noon there were the 3 wise men doing a parade in procession right in front of Mary and baby Jesus, and under the crowing of a rooster, which is the oldest automaton still preserved today, the rooster. And after that, this clock went to 3 different versions, but this is a drawing of the first version. After that, we've got the first clock in Paris, in l'Île de la Cité, which is an important name in Paris for watchmakers, in 1371. So it was the first clock of Paris, but you couldn't really see it. You just heard it every hours. The bell was rung by the mechanism, but on popular demand, a few years later, in 1418, King Charles V allowed a watchmaker to put a dial so everybody could read time any given time. It's important. Then you have the astronomical clock of Lyon, in the Cathedral of Lyon in 1379. This one also has so much automatons, and one with Mary, who turned to Angel Gabriel, which is represented by a dove who descends from the ceiling. So you have to know that at this time, those kind of mechanical clocks cost enormous amount of money. So the owning of the hours were reserved back then to clerical power and political power. It's important. And though those clocks were not really accurate, they could lose about hours a day, which is kind of huge. And you needed to wind the weights every 4 days or so, and it was not like just winding up your watch, no. It was like really heavy weights. And maybe the last one, the Grosse Horloge of Rouen, which means the big clock of Rouen in 1410. The dial here that you can see on the top left is 8.2 foot large. It still exists today. And on this dial you could read the hour, you could read the moon phases, and you could read the days in the week. I didn't mention, but in the other clocks you would have some astrolabes as well as some calendars for the Christian holidays. And so at the same time, there was the invention of the mainspring in 1410. So historians say that the mainspring was invented by an intelligentsia of skilled craftsmen that were working on the same subject at the same time without even knowing it. This is the typical answer of an historian who don't have a clue about where the mainspring was invented. We have one clue that say that it's a locksmith in Italy that would have transformed a spring that he had for his locksmithing work into a clock. But what's important for us is that it would allow us to miniaturize all the timepieces. So the watchmakers were happy to go from monumental clock to parquet clock, to table clock, and ultimately to watch. The shift of power is important here too, because before that, the hours owning was for political and clerical power, and with this miniaturization, it went to domestic. So everyone can own his own hour, which is kind of important. So, the story of the very first watch during the Renaissance period in Europe still regularly make the headlines in our little world. Indeed, we find some written statement that the first clockmaker was a German from Nuremberg called Peter Heinlein. And we have a written statement of 1511 that said that he made really little clocks that you could wear around the neck. So since then, everybody was trying to find those watches, those first watches, and some were found. But every time, some scientific research after that shows that it's not easy for a 6th century object to go through time without suffering from the scars of time and immense. And really often on those kind of objects that we call the tambour watch and drum watch, they find that some of the components didn't match with the period of time they were supposed to be fabricated. And we got some case of signature forgery and everything. So we're not really sure that we have a material evidence of this first watch. And the problem is the same in France. So the award for the first watch in France came to 2 watches, in fact. It was in Blois in 1518. Blois was then the capital of France. The kings, François Ier, made his residence in Blois. And all the watchmakers were there because all the timepieces were so expensive that you could only make them for the king and his court. So in 1518, on the contability books of the king, you have the presence of 200 gold coins that were rewarded to a certain Julien Coudray, who made 2 miniature clocks inserted in the pommels of 2 twin daggers for the king, which is quite impressive, but we don't have them. We're still looking for them. If you find some, tell me. It's important, because as I told you, the history of watchmaking will continue to evolve. It's important for us to know that back in the days there were raging in France a war between the 2 main religions Catholicism and Protestantism. And the peak of this war was the massacre of Saint-Barthélemy in 1572, which led to a massive immigration of Protestant people in Switzerland and in England. It's important because amongst those Protestant people, there were a lot of skilled watchmakers. And about watches, we like to say that Jean Calvin is the father of the development of the watches. It's not it's not easy to understand it at first glance when you know the story of the guy, but Calvin was a Frenchman who was a Protestant who immigrated to Switzerland and little by little gained power here. And he was all about austerity. He didn't like the tinsel of Catholicism, and he really didn't like all the outside sign of wellness. He gained so much power that in 1541 this Frenchman decided to simply I'm coming to it. To simply forbid the wear of jewelry in Geneva. Sorry for this. So, So all the craftsmen in the city of Geneva didn't know what to do because they couldn't do some jewelry. But we found out that Jean Calvin was kind enough to like watches and to consider that they were tools more than an accessory. So he allowed the people to make watches, which is maybe why Geneva became such a great place for watchmaking. And one could wonder what you would think of today's watchmaking, the austerity and everything. So. But we still have some watchmaker in France. And as you can see on the top left, there is a magnificent oval-shaped watch made by Nicolas Forfect in Paris in 1610. And this is maybe one of the first watch that foreshadowed what will become the complicated watch. So complication is an indication, a temporal indication which goes beyond just the hour. So this watch you can read the hour, but you can also set an alarm clock and see the moon phases on it. So it was the first one for wearable timepieces. And as those timepieces were getting complicated and complicated, they also were getting beautiful. As in 1632, Jean Toutain, who was a famous enameler in the time, invented a new process to do miniature painting. So before him, enamel was really putting one color in one particular surface, and if you try to put two colors in the same place, they will mix together. What Jean Toutain came up with is that he would make a blue sky background, then he would fire it to fix the color, then he would make a green background foreground, and he will make another fire to fix the color, and so on and so on. And so we'll see the first appearance of watches with exquisite little miniature paintings of all the famous painters. So kind of different from Geneva watchmaking in the days and the austerity. But the 17th century was also a great century for accuracy, because we had a guy named Christian Huygens. He was a Dutchman, and he came up with two new oscillatory systems. So based on the work of Galileo, he came up first in 1657 with the pendulum, So Galileo was working on isochronism. Isochronism is the fact that a physical system would oscillate at an accurate frequency and not move for it, despite all the changes of, let's say, amplitude. And amplitude is a really important thing for watchmaking, because the amplitude can change from despite the torque of the mainspring. So he applied this to clocks, and then he tried to apply this to watches and came up with the idea of the balance spring in 1675, sorry. So you could ask me what it has to do with France, as he was from Netherlands. Well, for making the first prototype of the watch with the balance spring, he was looking for the best skilled watchmaker in the place, and he chose a French one named Isaac Thuret. As far as the religion war was going, we had a few times of some kind of a peace found between the two religions, but this guy in the bottom right, Louis XIV, decided that it should no more be peace. And he did a revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which was the Edict of Tolerance that his grandfather signed about a century before him. So another time, a second wave of immigration to Switzerland and England. And among those Protestant refugees in London, there were the both brothers. And those guys, with Nicolas de Facio, who was a Swiss watchmaker, came up with a new idea and patented a process to drill jewels. So it could seem more like a jewelry breakthrough than a watchmaking one, but you should know that before them, all the bearings of all the mobiles in a watch would be drilled directly in the main plate. So it was a friction between metal and metal, which is never good. And so the lifetime of a watch was really short, and as the bearings were always wearing marks of wear and tears and ovalized the bearings. So when they came up with the idea of jewel for bearing, the accuracy of the watches went from 1 to 10, if you want. And the 18th century was really the century of accuracy. As I told you before, England set up the Longitude Act, which was a contest for the watchmaker will make the marine chronometer the more accurate possible. And the French, as you know, were stung in their ego by the forever enemy England and set up their own contest to do exactly the same thing, but, well, healthy competition. And two of the main characters of this French contest were Pierre Leroy and Ferdinand Berthoud. So Pierre Leroy is a French watchmaker, and Ferdinand Berthoud is a Swiss watchmaker who decided to settle in Paris. The two guys have really different approach of how to work on watchmaking. So Pierre Leroy could spend literally months and months to elaborate theoretical mechanism with all the mathematics and algorithm to make it perfect. And then he would go to the workbench. Ferdinand Berthoud, he had one idea, one prototype. Like he went to the workbench just the day after he got the idea. So it was much more prolific, but more empirical. And the two guys couldn't stand each other. It went as far as Ferdinand Berthoud, he was really better at promoting himself. And so he made a lot of books about transmitting the knowledge that all the prototypes that he made, and all the knowledge about marine chronometer, and he completely failed to remember to mention Leroy work in almost all of his book. Nice friend. But during this time, Pierre Leroy came up with a really great idea, which was the détente escapement. It was a major breakthrough in the development of the escapement, because it was one of the first really detached escapement. What we call detached escapement is when the oscillatory system, like the balance spring, will be completely free when it's doing its travel towards its oscillation. And before that, we have what we call a frictional rest escapement, where the condition of isochronism weren't met because the escapement was resting directly on the oscillatory system. So Pierre Leroy was the first who came with the détente escapement, and you should know that Ferdinand Berthoud did some variant of the détente escapement. And even if those guys have had two different methods of working, they both made these watches, this marine chronometer, great improvements, permitting easiest, fastest, and safest boat trips. And one man knew exactly what to do with those, to take advantage of those improvements. It was Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, the guy on the top right, that you may know because he smuggled some hundreds and hundreds of weapons right under the nose of the English to the George Washington troops. But before he was a weapon smuggler, he was also a famous writer that you may know for Figaro's Wedding. Don't know if it's ringing a bell. And before that, he was kind of a spy for the king also. And before that, he was a watchmaker. What a great life. And well, in his 20s, he was a son of a watchmaker. And in his 20s, he came up with a new escapement, which is kind of the ground when you are a watchmaker. He invented the double comma escapement, un échappement à double virgule. And the king's watchmaker, named Lepaute, at this time tried to stall his invention. But the young Caron de Beaumarchais went directly to the king's court, and he defended his case, and he won, and he became the king's watchmaker. And as a thank you, maybe, he did a really nice watch for Madame de Pompadour, which was the king's favorite. This watch was set in the ring, in fact, a very little watch. So after this watchmaking improvement, he became a writer, and he gained influence in the court, and he wanted everybody to forget that he was from common man origins. But all the guys were jealous and never failed to make him remember his origins. So the story said that in front of everybody, someone came with a very expensive gold watch and tried to give it to Caron de Beaumarchais, telling him, I'm sorry, but my watch doesn't work well, can you repair it? And Caron de Beaumarchais said, I'm sorry, but since I stopped the trade of watchmaking, I became very clumsy. But the guy insisted so much that he forced the watch in the hand of Caron de Beaumarchais, which feigns to observe it and drop it to the floor. Yeah, expensive watch to the floor. So while the guy was trying to recover all the components of the watch, Caron de Beaumarchais said to everybody, I told you I was very clumsy, and leave the room. So that was the kind of guy, Caron de Beaumarchais. Good guy. So, maybe in memory of the service founded by the French watchmaker Colin de Beaumarchais, your George Washington, later in 1788, he sent a letter to Governor Maurice, who happens to be in Europe, and tell him, well, can you buy me a watch, one of the best ones of Europe? And so Governor Maurice went to look for the best watch and wrote a letter back to George Washington telling him, okay, I found the guy, he's French, he's Jean-Antoine Lépine, and he made the best watch. You should know that Jean-Antoine Lépine is in fact the brother-in-law of Colin de Beaumarchais. Little world watchmaking, little world. And indeed, he made the best watch of this time. He changed the architecture of the movements. So before him, a typical watch would be two main plates fixed between them with pillars. And so it was really thick watches. Lépine came up with the idea that you could keep the main plate, get rid of some of the components, and instead of having a single main plate, put bridges. And this is still the architecture of movement that we use today. So great legacy for this man. And I'm sorry for the quality of the images that I choose, because I wanted you to saw the little signature on the dial of, trying to show you, there. It said, Invenite fecit. If it rings a bell for you, it's normal. So it's François Boljon new signature, which is an homage to our illustrious predecessor. At the same period, only a few years after the beginning of the revolution, industrial revolution in England, a watchmaker in Franche-Comté made his own little revolution at the scale of watchmaking. So Frédéric Japy bought some of the few clock and watchmaking machines in Switzerland that existed in the time, brought them to Franche-Comté, copied them, make new ones, hired dozens of employees, and assigned one employee per machine, and he invented what we call today manufacture. Before that, watches were made by hand, by craftsmen in their own home. And one man will gather all the components, will bring it to an assembly, and when the watch was assembled, they bring them to a dresser, which will mount it into a case. So really complicated process. Japy here, well, he hired a dozen of employees. He even housed them. He feed them, everything. Everybody was working under the same roof. He was taking dinner with his employees, reading every night a passage of the Bible. Well, quite a paternalist, but he's one of the founder of the industrial watchmaking. But it wasn't the only revolution that was going through our century in France. Because in 1789, the French Revolution burst. Big revolution, big one. And once the revolutionary managed to evict the power in place, the monarchy, it was the birth of our republic, and they wanted to get rid of all the tracks of clerical power and monarchical power. And so they changed many of our measurement system, and they decided to apply it to watchmaking and to use the decimal system in watchmaking. It's quite an adventure at this point. So the decimal system was saw by them as a more universal and more scientific way to calculate time. And so in one day of those guys, you'll have 10 hours. In each hours, you'll have 100 minutes, and in each minute, you'll have 100 seconds. Can you imagine the work for the watchmaker? That's a new law that allows you to say, okay, this watch and this clock is not available anymore, it's not good for reading time, so we must change it. It was terrible, terrible. No watchmaker would like to change all this, attitude. It's important for a watchmaker. And even the population didn't like the idea. But as you can see, some of the watchmakers comply to the new law, and we have some great timepieces with, dials with just 10 hours. But as the people didn't like to read those 10 hours and have noon at 5, some watchmakers made double-dialed timepieces. So you can choose which one you like. But didn't work as well, and the adventure of the decimal hours just lasts 17 months. That's a great story of spending way too much money on something useless. Nevertheless, some scientists were very happy with it, because it's more scientific. I don't exactly know why. Maybe, it's divided by 10 is more easy than divided by 12 and 60. I guess it's my answer. Okay, and so for the revolution, the French Revolution was born from the idea of the philosopher of the Lumière, the Enlightenment philosopher. One of them was Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, and also Voltaire. And this guy, after the revolution, before the revolution, he decided to make a new manufacturer of watches right next to Geneva border, because he was still in the idea of freeing the people. And back in the days in Geneva, watchmakers weren't really happy with the power in place. So he hired all the unhappy watchmakers from Switzerland in his fabric to make new watches. And do you know what technical director he chose for his factory? Well, it was Lépine, again. But Voltaire was not the only friend of Lépine. A new friend of Lépine was Abraham Louis Breguet. I think you know him. He's Swiss, but he did all the work in France. So I kind of appropriate him to France. It's convenient for the next lecture. And so he decided to install his workshop on l'île de la Cité, which was still the place where the Lépine and the Leroy workshop were, and Berthouz also. And he was inspired by those guys. But well, the student surpassed the masters by a lot. This guy invented the tourbillon. He invented the pare-chute, it is an anti-shock system. He invented the, what do you call it in English? Sorry. The gong spring for the repetition minute, if you want. As well as the terminal curve of the hairspring, which still bears his name. And he was so talented that the Queen Marie Antoinette, back in 1783, ordered a watch from him that would include all the complications known at the time. And Breguet did it, 23 complications. But unfortunately, Marie Antoinette couldn't never observe this magnificent watch, as she lost her head to the revolution. So too bad for her. Do you remember my little sentence about history that keeps evolving? Well, the story of the chronograph invention is one of the best examples that we have about that. For a long time, everybody thinks that the inventor of the chronograph was Nicolas Mathieu Rieussec, a Parisian watchmaker that would spend hours and hours on the side of horse race tracks. And so I came up with the idea that we all needed to know what time did the horse take to make the lap. And he made the first chronograph, which was in fact a table clock with a dial that would turn, and into the end you have a little recipient of ink, and when you push a button, a little drop of ink would fall on the dial, and so you would know the time that the horse take to make his lap. That's even why it's called a chronograph. Chrono for time and graph for writing, so the ink, everything. So, 1822. But, and famous brain made a lot of marketing about this little story. A lot of money spent. And in 2013, well, we have a new discovery of a timepiece that was 6 years youngest. It's the so-called chronograph that you can see on the bottom right, which was incredibly ahead of its time, because as you can see, it much more resembles today's chronograph than the one from Rieussec. So it was a piece made by Louis Moinet, who happens to don't call it a chronograph, because it didn't exist at the time, but a compteur de tierces. And the tierce was the fraction of a seventh. And sure enough, a Swiss brand decided to make a new brand out of this discovery. So, history keeps evolving. Talking about big brands, did you know that the co-founder of Patek Philippe was French? Yeah. Yeah. Yes, Jean-Adrien Philippe was a French watchmaker from Paris area, and he patented a keyless winding and hand-setting system. And he won a bronze medal for that in Exposition Universelle of Paris in 1944, and that's where he met Antoine Norbert de Patek. And then they would make Patek Philippe. And at the end of the century, the improvements kept going towards more industrial watchmaking, as Frémy and Verneuil, two French chemists, invented a way to replicate synthetically the production of rubies. So Frémy was the master. He came up with the idea, the invention, how to fabricate it. And Verneuil was the student, and he invented the process to make it on an industrial scale. And so the first client of this new process was watchmaking. So to begin with the 20th century, I will again talk to you about Leroy watch, the Leroy 01. But it has nothing to do with the prior Leroy I talked to you about. There is many Leroy in France. So this Leroy was a brand that had many very rich and powerful clients, and among them certain Antonio Gusto Carvalho Monteiro, which was a wealthy heir to the Portuguese family who made his fortune through the coffee trade. And this person in 1897 asked Leroy to manufacture, and I quote, everything that science and mechanics will make it possible to achieve in the volume of a watch. A bit like Marie's Antoinette order to Breguet 1 century earlier. So Leroy House teamed up with a Swiss watchmaker called P. Piguet to make this watch. And this watch counted 26 complications. And one of these complications is a hair hygrometer that specifically needs a blonde hair. I don't know why, but the story keeps, I think it's interesting. And so they present the first prototype of this watch in 1900 Paris Exposition Universelle again, and they won the gold medal. And from this date, it became the most complicated watch of the world for a long time, to 1989, when Patek Philippe came with the calibre 89 caliber, which has 33 complications, big one. But when some aimed for extreme complexity, others, like Louis Cartier on the top left, aimed for practicality. So he was friend with Albert Santos Dumont, which was a famous aviator back in the days. And this aviator told Louis Cartier, well, it's not really practical because I can't at the same time handle the control of the dirigible balloons or aircraft that I'm piloting. I don't know how you say that. And at the same time read the time on my pocket watch. And so, simply enough, Louis Cartier came up with the idea of wristwatches. It was not the first one, but wristwatches were more intended as a feminine refinement. And sure enough, he called this model the Santos Dumont. And the aviator, who was a big ego, was really happy with that. So he wears the watch everywhere. And he was really famous. So it was great publicity for Louis Cartier watch. And then we have the development of wristwatch more accepted amongst men wrists. Sadly enough, the story of the wristwatch completely being a new standard against the pocket watch is during the two World War, where the soldier needed the same practicality needs. And right after the Second World War, those same wristwatches have a major improvement by the birth of electrical watchmaking. So a famous brand, Lip, which was then owned by Fred Lippmann, a really eccentric guy, decided to start to work on prototyping the first electrical watch. It said that he classified the laboratory with a few watchmakers as top secret and put a security guard in front of the door. But in Franche-Comté, we are in Besançon here, and but you always work better with other people, and so he decided to team up with an American company, Elgin Watch Factory, in 1949, and he sent 20 engineers in the US to gather and exchange information about the two companies who were working on the same subject. And in 1952, they both of the company presented a prototype of the electrical watch. This is a major improvement because it's a breakthrough that led us one thing to another towards the quartz movement in the 70s. And so yes, the quartz is a technology that will have made the mechanical watch obsolete and my job absurd. And it also led to a major revolution as well as a major crisis in our trade. Crisis that even touched the Lip factory itself. And what would the presentation about France be if I didn't talk about a good strike? I'm coming to it. after the Baguette, the strike. So it was the time of the crisis, and all the watchmaking manufacturers were going through terrible times. Times where the biggest one, Lip Factory, and the employees learned that there were how do you say it? I'm sorry. Redundancy plan? Yeah, okay. A mass redundancy plan leading to the first demonstration. And they announced that the wages will not be paid, so sure enough, we did a big strike. And we even did a boss napping, which was one of the first. And then the worker confiscated all the watches. Yeah, big one, I told you. Continued to do some demonstration, and what will they do with the watches that were stashed absolutely everywhere in the area, even in some churches? Well, they decided to sell them. And it was a huge success. In 6 weeks, they made what the company would make in 6 months. Great one. And with the money, they decided, well, we're just gonna start the factory again and make more watches. And this is one of the first self-management adventure in France and in Europe. So they were back on the machines, and they have this mantra that is, you can read here, say, c'est possible, on fabrique, on vend, on se paye. It's possible, we manufacture, we sell, and we pay ourselves. That's a cool story. If you have the time to read about it, it's kind of an adventure. Their story of a stash of wigs of people. Great story. Great story about a big heist of watches. But it didn't last so long. About a year after the strike ended, but sure enough, the company survived this story and is still working today. So good for self-management. So I wanted to take a look at the 20th century through his creativity. France is well known for his haute couture, and it applies, this kind of creativity applies to watch also. So the top 3 watch of the left side are Cartier watch, and those guys could really think outside of the box. So the first one is called the tank. We don't really know if the watch was made after the tank drawing. The tank was a Renault F17 for the connaisseur. Or if the design came first and then the name was a great marketing idea. But it's an iconic model that still exists today. The second model is the cloche model, the bell one. It's also a nice model because you can wear it on your arm, but when you put it on the desk, it's made a table clock inspired by the receptionist clock in the hotels. And the third model is the crash one. The crash is from 1967, and I really like the legends that go with it. So the first legend is that Jean-Jacques Cartier came up with the idea by looking at the surrealist painting of Dali, Salvador Dali. And the second legend is that a client had a huge accident, car accident, with his Grand Baignoire model, which is another Cartier watch. And that his watch was broken and melted in the accident, which leads to this idea. But it was none of the 2 legends. It was just great creative spirits which respond to a market who in the 60s was in the search for something different. The three watches that you can see after that are Pierre Cardin's watch. Pierre Cardin is not a watchmaker at all. Pierre Cardin is a big name of haute couture in France. And he made this collection, and the three watches were part of this collection called the Espace collection for space. Very avant-garde for his time. Pierre Cardin was really fond of all that touch astronomical studies and space. He even went to visit the NASA at some point. On the top right, you can see a Triton model, a Spirotechnique. So this is a dive watch, really famous because the crown is at 12, and it was one of Commandant Cousteau's favorites, which is a big thing in France. And on the bottom line, it's 7 models from the same year catalog of LIP again. So in '75, LIP management decided to team up with 7 famous designers of the time, not watchmaker at all, to make their collection. And that was a great idea because, as you can see, it's crazy timepieces. For example, the one on the right is LIP Macdonald Chronograph, which was designed by Roger Talon, who is the father of French industrial design. After that, Roger Talon made the TGV, the fastest train on Earth for a moment. And on the left, you can see some timepieces that were really ahead of their time. Can you see that they are monoblock plastic watches and very colorful? Does it remind you of something? Yeah, it was almost 10 years before the birth of this watch. But again, the Swiss wins. But this is the kind of creativity that we have in France, and it's quite inspiring for some of us that try to embrace this creativity nowadays. So I will talk a bit about my work, as it seems to me that it's a good link between past and present, as the concept of the brand is to restore old mechanism and give them a second chance in the new casing. So the old part is really just the mechanism, and the new part is all the rest, and it's conceived and made in France, very locally. And so I wanted to present you the LIP limited edition. LIP again, I'm really fond of this brand, and we make a collaboration. So it was our first really 100% French watch, and after that. We made a watch with Alain Farmelo, which is here tonight, and the Beaumarchais company, which is American, of 20 pieces of this transatlantic, so American movement in the French watch. And even if my work is a one-man operation, I really never feel completely alone. Because I'm happy to tell you that even if we take 30 more years than Swiss watchmaking to get up after the crisis, we are nowadays about 70 brands in France. I mean, there is a great dynamic, there is refreshing designs, and I really don't have the time to present all the watches to you. But if you want to come back to one or another model or brand in the Q&A session, feel free to ask me. I will be happy to give you some details about those watches. And to finish, I would like to turn myself towards the future, just to let you know that we have 12 watchmaking schools in France. So we teach hundreds and hundreds of watchmaker each year, So I really encourage you to go to see what those guys will make. Some of them will restore our patrimony and all the things that we talked earlier, and some of them will make new brands. So I'm really confident that France was, is, and will be another land of watchmaking. I don't think you can read it. I'm sorry, if you want the detail about the resources, I can give it to you after that.
Beautiful, Colin. Thank you so much for your lecture. It was really informational, and it was really great to hear about someone other than Switzerland for a change. So that was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to open up the floor now for Q&A. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Thank you very much for the great lecture. There's one name I was hoping you would mention. Janvier.
Yeah.
He was a great clockmaker.
Absolutely.
He invented the resonance clock. And at the age of, I believe, 17, he presented a clock to the Academy of Sciences of Besançon. And he was doing well until the revolution.
Yeah.
He became broke. It's said that he sold his tool to Breguet. I have to verify that.
I didn't know that. I will try to find the information.
Yes. And he died broke.
Yeah.
And on his death certificate, it says, Janvier, no trade, and cause of death, old age.
Tough. Yes, I didn't talk about him just because I had to choose. As you see, it was a long presentation, and I really had to choose. But what I can tell you, it's not big, but Nick asked me for visuals to promote the lecture, and I made a little photo montage of a French flag on a clock. I don't know if you see him, and it was one of Janvier clock. Voilà. But yes, it was a great watchmaker. I didn't study him that much for tonight, so I don't have so much answer to come back to you, but I will.
My understanding is that F.P. Journe. My understanding is that F.P. Journe is quite knowledgeable about Janvier.
Yeah.
And he has one of his clocks, one of Janvier's clocks in Journe's atelier.
Yeah. There is Journe, and there is also Denis Flageolet, which is the watchmaker of de Béthune, who is really fond of Janvier's work. Janvier is not so known because all his work was about clock, and nowadays watchmaking is the reading of this race, so maybe this explains a bit.
Great, thank you very much for that. Anyone else have a question? Just raise your hand.
So why did Ile de la Cité become such an important place for French watchmakers?
Because it was the place where the first clock was installed, and after that all the watchmakers installed their workshop on this island. I don't exactly know why, but it was the Bermuda Triangle of watchmaking in France. Yes, and the Horloge de la Cité is still there. You can visit this part.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Coming back to the front.
Thank you very much for the presentations. want to know if that is kind of what inspired you towards your company's kind of background, where you're using vintage movements in new cases and kind of looking to marry old and new.
When we study watchmaking in France, we study watchmaking, we study clockmaking, we study fabrication, and we study restoration. So from my early days in watchmaking, we always make this link between past and present. So yes, indeed, it's the origin of Semper and Adhuc, I think. It's a trade that, as I told you about an obsolete technology, we always look back in the mirror. You know, we always look back to what our predecessor made before us, to try to be inspired, but it's a job where past and present are really, really binded together.
Awesome. Any other questions in the back?
Thank you for the lecture. I have a question regarding why has it been so hard for true manufacturers to set up in France? The only ones, after you came on the scenes, the only ones I had heard before that were Breguet and Yima. And then obviously there have been some others like you pointed out, Semper Technique, but why historically, after the revolution and after the growth of watchmaking from the 1700s, 1800s, has it been so hard for true manufacturers to set up in France?
There were some true manufacturers until the crisis, if you want. But the market was local. It was a national market. So people abroad will generally don't have heard about the manufacturer that we've got. And after the quartz crisis, well, I'm going to take the story on the point of view of Swiss. So they came up with the Swatch, which is a great product, obviously, and they make a ton of money with the Swatch, and then they buy back some big manufacturers, some big houses, big names of watchmaking, and they are doing the haute horlogerie suisse, well-known haute horlogerie suisse. We just didn't hit that in France. We weren't able to do that, and we were still teaching many watchmakers their trade, but they, and I did it too, I went to Switzerland to work, because it's how globalization works. I mean, the job were there, and as a watchmaker, you want to work on the best pieces, and it was in Switzerland. Then maybe just social and economical environment in France with the strikes and everything is maybe not the best one, maybe suited for haute horlogerie. I don't know. I maybe lack of objectivity on this subject to let you know, but I don't have any employee right now, so no strikes. So I think it's a good country to start a watchmaking business, but maybe I'm not the best person to be asked for this question. I don't know. The Swiss had the greatest idea in this subject at the moment. So we're just on a new path to follow their lead, but it takes time.
Great. Okay. Any final questions?
Thank you for the lecture. And following up from the question my colleague had asked, where there appears to be no shortage of design flair for French watchmaking, at least from an aesthetic point of view. But from a vertically integrated manufacturer point of view, from a like in-house movement, or from an industrial point of view, could you speak more on any contemporary French brands that are sort of leading the charge, that are trying to be that hub? In short, is there a French equivalent to the Swatch Group? Thank you.
Good question. Yes, it's coming back and it's very new. We'll have Yema, who is back in the game of in-house watchmaking. So Yema is a brand that is working mostly on Kickstarter right now, and they just released their own automatic micro-rotor watch movement. We also have Pekinier. Pekinier is a very old and famous watch brand, and they make their own movement, and I think the project is to sell it to other brands in France particularly. You already have Pierre Lamier, which is another French brand who bought some of the movement of Pekinier. And you have a new group called Ion Group, which is currently also working on the making movement in France, back in France. So there is this dynamic around watchmaking, and everybody is trying to make their own movement, which is ultimately the graal of watchmaking. But it takes time. I mean, even in Switzerland, there are not so much people that make their own movement. There are the Swatch Group, as you say, Celita, Soprod, and many équipementiers, we call them in France. I don't know how to tell it in English, but people that specifically make just movements and sell them to brands. So we're gonna, I think there is some project that go towards this direction in France right now.
Okay, I think there was one hand up in the front. Okay, how about these two questions and then we'll wrap up.
You mentioned that there are 12 watchmaking schools in France. What's the typical program like and the duration? And do you have an idea of how many certified watchmakers that are certified each year?
So the typical you get three degrees, different diplomas. You get the CAP, the Certificate of Professional Aptitude. You get the BMA, which is the Brevet des Métiers d'Art, and you get the DMA. It has changed now. It's called DMAID, design, I think. So overall, it's 6 years of study, but you can stop every 2 years. So it's 6 different grades of watchmaking, and if you go to the final grade, you are kind of a complete polyvalent watchmaker. And as I told earlier, you'd be taught about clockmaking, watchmaking, restoration, art history, because you have to become kind of an expert of all the pieces that people bring to you to repair. Restoration, fabrication, clock swatch, monumental clock, quartz watch also. I mean, the Scholar watchmaking courses in France is very general. In Swiss, they ask you to choose between reparation or fabrication early in the studies. In France, we keep this very generic and polyvalent watchmaking studies. As for the numbers, I don't know exactly because, well, when I was in the watchmaking study 1 year, we were 3 in Paris. And some years they are 15, some years they are up to 30. So it depends on the 3 degrees and it depends on the schools. So I don't really know. I would tell you that each year, no doubt there is 100 watchmakers certified each year in France, but I think it's more. I will have to ask.
Thank
Okay, and then one last question over here.
Thank you. Maybe two quick ones. Would it be fair to say we have Pierre Cardin to blame for the fashion watch? And can you speak a little bit about your process in choosing a movement that you might work with and how you source them?
Why do you want to blame him? Those watches, if you happen to cross one of them in a flea market, buy it. Well, taste and colors, you can't really judge. That's my response to that. As far as for choosing the movement, as I told Philippe earlier, it's like when you go to a restaurant on the seashore, depends on the fishing of the day. It's my little treasure hunt every day to go for those little movements. They are not always easy to find. So there is two things that guide me through choosing one of them. The first thing is the quantity. If I find enough quantity of one reference, I will stick to this reference of movements. It's not industrialization, but it's kind of optimization of my work. The second one is some basic measurement that I need to respect in order to be able to put the movement into the cases that are machined in advance. They are machined in a little factory in Périgord, but they asked me to buy in advance 50 of the cases. And some of the adjustments need to be really precise. Imagine you have, how do you call it, the tige de remontoir, the chrome. If it's just like that, on the second winding it will break. So we got to respect such measurements to be able to make watch that last long.
Wonderful. Okay, let's give Monsieur de Tonnac one more round of applause. And on behalf of the Horological Society of New York, for everybody that joined us, we want to thank you so much for your support over the year, and we wish you a very happy holiday season and a safe and happy new year, and we'll see you in 2023.